Now we turn to one of O'Connor's short stories, and what we're going to be talking about is A Good Man is Hard to Find, and should give you a spoiler alert. If you haven't read the short story, you probably ought to stop now and read it, because we're going to be looking primarily at the conclusion to the story. This story is probably O'Connor's best known short story. It's the title of her first collection of short stories. It's the story that is most often anthologized in a high school class survey of literature, or freshman or sophomore in university anthology of literature or anthology of American literature. This story is fairly straightforward, although the ending is such, and there's enough nuance to the ending, that there are plenty of people who read it and come away perhaps with a feeling of frustration, certainly a feeling of disturbance because of the violence that's involved in the end of the story. But it's a pretty straightforward storyline, and so it's a good one for us to talk about as we begin. Also, we could say that the story encapsulates several characteristics of O'Connor's writing. The first is the most important, I think, certainly central to her concerns, and that is the need that human beings have for self-knowledge, but how difficult it is for us to acquire that self-knowledge. Another characteristic of O'Connor's writing that's in the story we've already mentioned, and that is of violence. And so it's an episode of grace, but it's an episode of violent grace. And this story is a bit more violent than some of her stories. And then lastly, in terms of the characteristics of her writing, we've got a distortion of characters. That is, whereas in some stories, perhaps even with some other authors, their portrayal of an individual in the story is one that might be balanced. That is, you see their good traits, you see their bad traits. O'Connor's people aren't so lucky, because what she's all about is distorting their personality in such a way that you can't miss their flaws. That is, that you have to pay attention to their weaknesses, to those things that would annoy you and annoy others in the story. So the story is about a grandmother. She's never named other than the grandmother. She lives with her family, with her son, daughter-in-law, and her grandchildren. And the family is taking a vacation. Now they're taking a vacation in an area that, and she protests about where they're going. She complains about everything. And so if there's anything that's most conspicuous about the grandmother, it is her self-centeredness. And that's the thing that's pretty annoying, and you could see that it brings a lot of annoyance to her family. And we, as the reader, would look at the grandmother and perhaps say, I'm just glad she doesn't live with me. Or we might say, gosh, I do have a family member like that, and so I can relate to the story pretty easily. So the story pretty quickly reaches its denouement, the climax, and that occurs when the family, in the family car, all together going to vacation, have an accident. The accident is precipitated by grandmother giving bad information to the driver, and also because the grandmother insisted on bringing her cat with her on the vacation, which the family had asked her not to do. So she's the immediate and continuing cause of the family's distress. And so the family has an accident, and they find themselves face to face with several men. Before this part of the story, the grandmother had been reading the newspaper about an escaped convict called the Misfit. And so at unfortunate part of the story, as it continues, the grandmother not only recognizes that the leader of this little band of criminals is the Misfit. Not only that, but in addition to that, she says out loud his identity, at which point the Misfit says, it would have been better if you had not said that, if you had not recognized me. Now, very quickly, the story begins or the tragedy begins to unfold as the Misfits' accomplices take the family members one by one into the forest, and all the reader knows, all the grandmother knows, is you hear gunshots. So very quickly you realize that what's going on is the execution of the family members one by one. And again, this has been caused by the grandmother. While this is going on there, you've got this really interesting theological discussion going on between the grandmother and the misfit. And what's really interesting about this is the misfit seems to understand theology better than the grandmother does. So at this point, let's just look at a passage, if we could, and then we'll talk about it just for a moment. So the misfit says, Jesus was the only one who ever raised the dead, the misfit complained, and he shouldn't have done it. He thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw everything away and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said, and his voice had become almost a snarl. So what's going on in this exchange? This passage has gotten a fair amount of attention by scholars and readers also. And what is most striking about the passage is that the misfit seems to have better theological grounding than the grandmother does. At this point, we could generalize just a little bit and see that a lot of O'Connor's victims, those who suffer from the violent grace that intrudes their lives, a lot of them, if they practice religion, it's a watered-down, superficial religion. You might say they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. That is, on the one hand, they want to be recognized as someone who is respectable. On the other hand, religion can only go so far. And these characters don't want these religious ideas, and certainly the spirituality associated with religion, to intrude into their lives and complicate their lives in any kind of way. So the misfit in these lines is stating the gospel in stark terms, sort of in black and white. And he says, either he said what he did, and if he did, then there's nothing to do but to throw everything away and to follow him. Or if he didn't say what he did, if he wasn't who he was, then there are no restraints at all. And so you ought to indulge yourself in whatever kind of meanness that you are interested in. So this is a corrective to the grandmother's religion, whatever it might be, but the misfit's theological comments help us to understand that the grandmother's religious commitment is one that is largely self-serving and ambivalent and fairly inconsequential. Now, having said that, let's now read a passage that describes the next violent episodes that occur at the end of the story. Now we're picking up with where we left off. Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying, and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the misfit said. I wished I had been there. He said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I had been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, Why? "You're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground, took off his glasses, and began to clean them. So, what in the world has just occurred in this disturbing episode? And where's the grace? Well, the grace is this fleeting moment in which the grandmother is able to get out of herself, get out of her self-pity, escape from her self-interestedness, escape from this personality that manipulated all those around her and caused them tragedy, if not distress. And this grace is expressed when she says to the misfit, "Why, you're one of my children." It's a moment of compassion. She understands that the misfit has suffered, and in a sense, he did not have the opportunity that she did, and he even regrets that in the beginning of the episode that we just looked at. And that's the moment of grace. That's it. And then the misfit reacts to that in the instinctive, hostile way that he's learned because of what he's suffered in life, and he shoots their grandmother 3 times in the chest. So where is the grace in that? Well, there it was. And so O'Connor leaves us at a point where we understand that the grandmother, perhaps for the first time in her life, or at least for decades, is somebody different, and we hope that she sees herself for what she is, and she is able to exercise a kind of an empathy and compassion that has been absent from her life. And that's it. So why does it have to be this way? Well, why couldn't there have been a discussion? Why did her son and daughter-in-law and children all have to be executed? Well, the misfit sort of explains that. He explains why O'Connor could not have been more gentle with her protagonist, because in the last few lines of the story, after one of his accomplices remarks on how much the grandmother talked, referring to that as kind of an obnoxious habit, the misfit says she would have been a good woman if she would have had somebody there to kill her every minute of her life. What's the reason for that? O'Connor is trying to tell us it is just that hard for us to receive grace and to respond to grace and to overcome the moral and spiritual pathologies in our life.